The one that was really dangerous for me was the time that we need to distribute the books and notebooks to the very far village. I was working with an international organization teaching the girls out there. So we put all the books in the back of the car. Of course, my father-in-law and the driver accompanied me. During the way, crossing the road, we stopped by the Taliban. They keep everyone separate so they cannot listen to each other. So I was the only woman sitting out there. All the trunks in back of our cars were full of the books. I was really sure that this time they will definitely kill me.
This was 1999, when the Taliban first ruled Afghanistan. They oppressed Afghans with laws drawn from tribal codes and a strict interpretation of Islam. Their control was total and brutal. 2 decades later, the Taliban have taken back power.
Every year I've seen how the Taliban, they grew stronger. They have taken over Afghanistan twice, not because they're good at governing, but because of the other actors in Afghanistan, because of their failures.
Fled the country. Afghanistan falls to Taliban control.
Afghanistan. Soviet troops were everywhere throughout the capital and the country. Moscow claimed they were there because they'd been invited. That version of events found few believers elsewhere.
In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to back an ally, the new communist Afghan government. Together, they wanted to transform the country into a socialist state, but they faced resistance.
The Afghan crisis won't be easily dismissed, and a glance at the map shows why.
Afghanistan is a deeply divided country. At the time, only a small fraction of the population lived in a few major cities, including some who supported the government. But the majority of Afghans lived in rural areas, where people were generally poor, conservative, and very devoted to Islam and tribal traditions. For many, authority came from tribal leaders of their respective ethnic groups, not the government in Kabul. So when the communist Afghan government tried to enforce land reforms and abolish social codes, rural Afghans revolted. They formed independent militias, but were collectively known as the Mujahideen.
These are real Mujahideen. They are scattered, almost impossible to unite. They operate best in small groups and in their home, the mountains.
The Soviet army managed to occupy the cities, but met fierce resistance from the Mujahideen in rural areas. The Soviets responded by pounding the countryside with bombs, razing entire villages. But it galvanized more people to join the rebellion. Thousands of Muslim volunteers from around the world joined the Mujahideen. Countries eager to gain influence in Afghanistan started arming and funding militias. Even the US sent weapons to drain the Soviets, their main rival. The support allowed the Mujahideen to fight for 10 years. Around 1 million Afghans died and 6 million were displaced. In 1989, the Soviets gave up and left. 3 years after that, the Afghan communist government fell. But the violence didn't end. The Mujahideen groups turned on each other, and by 1992, Afghanistan was consumed by civil war.
Door to door, street to street, road to road, region to region, province to province, there was always fighting.
This is Sweta Nori. She was born and raised in Afghanistan, and has worked there for years promoting education and women's rights.
They start searching the houses to find if there is a beautiful or young woman so they can marry by force. It was a really worse time.
Kandahar was especially violent. Several Mujahideen and criminal groups terrorized the population. In the spring of 1994, a group of locals here had had enough. They asked this man, Muhammad Omar, for help. He had fought in the Soviet War before becoming a teacher, or mullah, at an Islamic school called a madrasa. He and a few other mullahs gathered some students and drove out the Mujahideen. When more students joined, they captured the whole district, then Kandahar city. This group became known as the Taliban, which means the students in Pashto. As the sole militia in Kandahar, they brought peace for the first time in years. And that's exactly why many people supported them.
If the mullahs and imams says that the color of the milk is black, all the people accepting that because it comes from mullahs. Why not giving them opportunity to take over the government?
At this point, the Taliban were all members of Afghanistan's largest ethnic group, the Pashtuns, which made it easier for them to take over the mostly Pashtun areas in the south. Then they moved west and north, defeating some warlords and bribing others to join them. As they gained territory, they also found a way to fund their expansion. By taking over these highways, they raised millions through taxes, and by gaining control of Afghanistan's poppy-growing regions, they profited from the illegal opium trade. But the most crucial support came from a neighbor. Pakistan was worried that one of these mujahideen groups would take power and ally with its enemy, India, effectively surrounding them. So they gave the Taliban tons of weapons early on. In September 1996, the Taliban entered Kabul and took control of Afghanistan.
My name is Najib Haja. I've been covering the war in Afghanistan for 17 years. When the Taliban, they took Kabul in 1996, they set up a government that was basically only their members.
Both its leadership and fighting base were predominantly Pashtun teachers and students.
So it was basically a very inexperienced government without any practical knowledge about how to govern.
Yet they decided to remake the country based on a religious ideology that took shape in their madrasas.
What makes the Taliban special is that these madrasas, called Deobandi madrasas, are inspired by a certain interpretation of Islam, influenced by Pashtun culture.
Music, television, and even flying kites were banned. Men had to grow beards. But the most draconian rules were placed on women.
They weren't allowed to go out without a male relative. They couldn't educate themselves. They were practically banned from working.
Many schools for girls went underground, like the one Sweden ran in Kabul.
It was only 20 meters away from the Taliban camp. I had good number of the students coming to my school. It was all done in secret. And one day, the Taliban entered. So I stopped them in front of the door and I asked them to wait. And my student just noticed that they hide the books, take out the Holy Qurans.
What would have been the punishment if you had been caught?
They would start beating me, and same thing they would do with the family of the girls.
Beatings, stonings, and public executions were common punishments under the Taliban regime. It's why most countries, except Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, refused to recognize them as a legitimate government. But the Taliban soon found other allies.
The most wanted terrorist in the world, Osama bin Laden.
Sheltered by Afghanistan's ruling Taliban.
The ruling Taliban's refusal to surrender suspected terrorist bin Laden.
The U.S. will hold Afghanistan responsible for any attack linked to bin Laden.
You are looking at obviously a very disturbing live shot there. That is the World Trade Center.
After the 9/11 attacks, a U.S.-led coalition invaded Afghanistan to hunt down bin Laden and topple the Taliban. With the help of these mujahideen leaders, it took less than 3 months to capture Kabul. Bin Laden escaped, but the Taliban regime surrendered and asked for amnesty. The U.S. refused.
So basically the Taliban, they don't get a choice. They can either become prisoners or continue fighting.
The Taliban leadership fled to Pakistan, while most fighters went into hiding in rural Afghanistan. Then the U.S. promised to rebuild the country and turn it into a democracy. It worked with the UN to set up an Afghan government and army, and invited mujahideen leaders to run the local governments. Then they gave the government billions of dollars to build roads, bridges, hospitals, and utilities in the cities and rural areas. But many of those projects never took shape. The Afghan government was deeply corrupt and stole millions. And in 2003, the US invaded Iraq and diverted a lot of its money. What remained was spent mostly in the cities, while rural Afghanistan was neglected and increasingly under attack. While the US was trying to rebuild Afghanistan, it was simultaneously waging a war on it. The American military was hunting down the Taliban and al-Qaeda members, largely in these rural areas, and funding and arming these mujahideen leaders in exchange for their help. But it all backfired. Drone strikes and night raids increasingly killed innocent civilians, and the mujahideen leaders started terrorizing people, effectively becoming warlords.
The suffering of Afghanistan in certain parts of the country has not ended. We still keep losing our civilian lives. is becoming to be heavy for us. It's not understandable anymore.
Basically, the Americans, they created their own monsters.
As early as 2004, the Taliban leadership regrouped in Pakistan and started recruiting fighters. Like the 90s, they attracted Pashtun fighters in the south and east. But this time they also attracted non-Pashtuns, including Afghans from the west and north.
But the thing that they have in common is that they are from rural Afghanistan. They had been harassed by the local authorities. They had relatives being killed by US aerial bombings. They were caught between a rock and a hard place, and they ended up choosing the hard place, and that was the Taliban.
Soon they were ambushing US, NATO, and Afghan troops, and introducing more sophisticated tactics, like roadside bombs and suicide attacks. Enlisting diverse groups, even those that didn't share their strict religious beliefs, made it possible for the Taliban to take territory in many parts of the country. For funding, they relied on familiar tactics, taxing highways and trading poppy. Plus, they continued to have help from Pakistan, who not only protected Taliban leaders, but also armed, funded, and trained their fighters. By 2008, the Taliban controlled huge swaths of rural Afghanistan and even threatened some cities.
And as Commander-in-Chief, I have determined that it is in our vital national interest to send an additional 30,000 U.S. troops to Afghanistan.
In 2009, the U.S. responded by sending a surge of troops for 18 months. They cleared major cities, but couldn't dislodge the Taliban from the rural areas. In 2012, the U.S. reduced its troops and relied on the Afghan government and army to lead the fight. But years of corruption had led many Afghans to distrust the government, leaving room for the Taliban to start governing their own territories. But this version of the Taliban's governance was more flexible than their rule in the 90s.
In some places, their governments looked very much like the old Taliban in the mid-90s. In other areas, they were much more pragmatic. They had girls' schools, and they didn't practicize, rules about beard and TV shows. It was a proof that you had a very fragmented Taliban.
That was the key that allowed them to consolidate power and wait for the US to leave. In February 2020, the Trump administration went straight to the Taliban to strike a deal. They agreed to leave Afghanistan. In August 2021, the Biden administration delivered on that deal. As the final troops pulled out, the Taliban attacked. The world watched as the Afghan army surrendered, the government fled, and the Taliban entered Kabul unopposed. In September, the Taliban announced a new interim government, and it looks familiar. Its top leadership is mostly Pashtun, many of whom served in the 1990s regime. But their base, like their fighters, is far more diverse, which makes this new regime unpredictable.
It will be a problem for the Taliban if they don't tolerate the variation of interpretation of Islam in their movement, which could end up with a violent conflict between the different parties. I'm convinced that they haven't agreed on what kind of Afghanistan they want right now.
There is a small window of hope if the international community put force on the Taliban. Just make sure that the women and people have their basic needs, access to education, access to job, access to freedom.